On June 22, 1941, history witnessed an event that would reshape the course of World War II, Operation Barbarossa. At dawn, over 3 million German soldiers crossed the border into the Soviet Union, supported by more than 3,500 tanks and 7,000 aircraft. Hitler's plan was nothing short of audacious, a lightning strike, intended to crush the Soviet state within months. But this was not just a military operation. It was the embodiment of Nazi ideology. Hitler believed in the inevitable collapse of the Bolshevik regime, convinced that communism was rotten to its core, and that the Slavic peoples were incapable of defending themselves. He had been plotting this invasion for nearly 2 decades. Even as early as the 1920s, Hitler dreamed of an Eastern Empire, Levens, where German settlers would expand across vast tracts of land, securing resources and space for the master race. By 1941, having conquered France and much of Western Europe, Germany had achieved near a legendary momentum. Blitzkrieg had proven unstoppable. Hitler assumed the Soviet Union, vast yet politically fragile, would crumble just as quickly. Yet as the first columns advanced into Soviet territory, the sheer scale of what lay ahead began to reveal cracks, even in his grand vision. How could one man's overconfidence face the immensity of a continent? The Wehrmacht was divided into 3 massive army groups. Army Group North aimed for Leningrad, Army Group Center for Moscow, and Army Group South for Kyiv. Speed was everything. Blitzkrieg the lightning. War relied on fast-moving, concentrated armored units breaking through enemy lines, supported by artillery and near-total air superiority. The Luftwaffe quickly gained control of the skies, destroying thousands of Soviet aircraft on the ground. By all appearances, Hitler's assumptions seemed justified. Victory appeared not just likely, but inevitable. Yet even as German troops marched hundreds of kilometers into the Soviet heartland, a critical reality began to emerge. The Red Army, though caught off guard, was far from defeated. Its soldiers, motivated by survival and patriotism, retreated strategically, drawing the invaders deeper into a labyrinth of forests, rivers, and swamps. Soviet resistance was not collapsing. It was morphing into something more elusive, more dangerous. German officers noted supply wagons struggling along rutted roads, tanks bogged down in mud, and the first whispers of frostbite among troops. Could Hitler's lightning war survive the immensity of the Russian landscape? Please, if you are enjoying this deep dive into history, click the subscribe button and like the video. It helps more people see this incredible story of courage, overconfidence, and strategy. Pilate Sumer. The Wehrmacht had captured vast territories, taking hundreds of thousands of prisoners and seizing enormous caches of Soviet material. Army Group Center appeared unstoppable, sweeping across Belarus and approaching Smolensk with terrifying efficiency. But Hitler's ambition outpaced military logic. The plan demanded speed, yet divisions became overstretched. German tanks advanced ahead of their infantry, supply lines frayed, and commanders found themselves making ad hoc decisions in a theater larger than any they had encountered. Meanwhile, Soviet reinforcements were pouring in from the east, unseen reserves quietly moving to fortify key positions. A pivotal mistake lay in Hitler's underestimation of the Soviet winter and the resilience of its people. Though the soldiers were well trained, the Nazis had prepared poorly for the months ahead. The idea of a quick victory blinded them to logistical realities: fuel shortages, worn-out vehicles, and the difficulties of supplying a mechanized army over thousands of kilometers. Yet, despite these growing problems, Hitler's propaganda machine maintained a narrative of unstoppable triumph. By autumn, the first signs of trouble were becoming impossible to ignore. German advances slowed, morale wavered, and yet Hitler refused to reconsider his plans. His belief in ideological inevitability, his conviction that the Soviet Union would simply collapse, was beginning to collide with the unforgiving reality of geography and climate. The vast Eastern Front was proving itself a far more formidable opponent than any army could anticipate. The gamble had begun, but the stakes were far higher than even the Führer realized. And as the Germans pressed on toward Moscow, deeper into forests that seemed endless, questions began to surface within the Wehrmacht. Could they really maintain momentum across such distances? Were their supply lines robust enough to support a full-scale advance into winter? Unbeknownst to them, the Soviets were quietly preparing for a fight that would test the limits of human endurance, industrial capacity, and military ingenuity. What awaited the Germans was not the quick victory they had dreamed of. It was a relentless confrontation that would shake the very foundations of their war machine. At the opening of Operation Barbarossa, the Wehrmacht seemed unstoppable. Tanks surged forward in tight columns, crushing Soviet defensive lines, while dive bombers tore through supply depots and airfields. Cities fell in weeks rather than months, and Soviet troops, often unprepared and poorly equipped, were encircled in massive pockets, surrendering by the tens of thousands. It was the very definition of Blitzkrieg lightning war, overwhelming force and speed. On the surface, Hitler's assumptions appeared vindicated. The Red Army was on the defensive, retreating eastward, leaving behind scorched fields and abandoned equipment. Yet, beneath this apparent success, the foundations of the German plan were beginning to wobble. Despite early victories, cracks in the German strategy began to emerge. The vast distances of the Soviet interior meant that supply lines stretched thin almost immediately. Fuel shortages, worn-out vehicles, and broken roads slowed armored divisions that had once moved with terrifying speed across Western Europe. Commanders in the field grew increasingly concerned. Tanks outpaced infantry, artillery lagged behind, and units found themselves dangerously exposed to counterattacks. For every Soviet city that fell, another 100 miles of hostile terrain awaited them, each with forests, rivers, and marshes that turned into natural traps. It was a race not against the Red Army alone, but against geography itself. In September 1941, Army Group Center reached Smolensk, only a few hundred kilometers from Moscow. Here, German forces faced unexpectedly fierce Soviet resistance. Entire divisions had been relocated from Siberia and the Far East, trained in the brutal realities of winter combat, and now they were dug into fortified lines. Hitler, impatient for a decisive strike, diverted his forces south to encircle pockets of Soviet troops near Kilu. While this move created tactical victories, it delayed the push toward Moscow, a decision historians often cite as the first critical misstep of time. The Germans would soon learn, was an enemy as relentless as any Red Army soldier. As October approached, the environment itself became a formidable opponent. The Russian autumn, or Rasputitsa, transformed roads into mud-choked quagmires. Trucks sank into the soil. Artillery became immobile, and tanks to run symbols of unstoppable power ground to a halt. Supply convoys were delayed or destroyed. Ammunition ran low, and soldiers faced hunger and exhaustion. German units were now fighting not just against Soviet resistance, but against nature itself. The dream of a swift, decisive victory that had seemed within grasp in June now appeared to be slipping further and further away. Even as the Germans struggled, the Soviets demonstrated a remarkable capacity for adaptation. Reinforcements arrived continuously, defensive lines were rebuilt, and scorched earth tactics destroying anything useful before retreating stymied German advances. Cities were abandoned, but factories were dismantled and moved east, out of reach of the invaders. The Red Army, far from collapsing, was transforming the war into a grinding, attritional struggle. Each delay in the German timetable allowed the Soviets to recover, regroup, and fortified, turning apparent chaos into a strategic advantage. The winter that loomed on the horizon promised to change everything. German soldiers, expecting a swift campaign, were unprepared for sub-zero temperatures. Frostbite and illness began taking their toll, often exceeding casualties from combat itself. Yet Hitler continued to push for the offensive, convinced that Moscow's fall would end the war. His ideology, rooted in racial and political overconfidence, blinded him to reality. Supply shortages, overextended lines, and exhausted troops were warnings he ignored at his peril. The first wave of Siberian reinforcements began to trickle into the Moscow sector. These troops, experienced in harsh winter conditions, were well-equipped, disciplined, and ready to fight. The Germans, meanwhile, had only partially winterized equipment and clothing, making every kilometer of advance an ordeal. Soviet artillery rained down on advancing tanks, sniper teams picked off officers, and ambushes in dense forests inflicted mounting losses. The initial brilliance of Blitzkrieg was fading, replaced by the grim reality of attrition, exhaustion, and error. As German forces approached the outskirts of Moscow, tension within the Wehrmacht was palpable. Officers whispered about the dangers of continuing the advance without adequate reinforcements. Supplies were insufficient, morale was slipping, and Hitler remained stubbornly optimistic. The German army faced a paradox. It was still strong, yet every advantage it had enjoyed in June was evaporating. Moscow, the jewel in the crown of Barbarossa, loomed ahead a prize that might slip away entirely if miscalculations continued. And as the first winter snows began to fall, both the soldiers and their commanders could feel that something had shifted. The war was no longer a march of conquest, but a test of endurance, cunning, and willpower. The moment of truth approached. Would the German army, exhausted and overextended, manage to capture Moscow, or had the Blitzkrieg reached the limits of its power? The answer would not only determine the fate of the Eastern Front, but also the trajectory of the entire war. The stage was set for a confrontation where strategy, preparation, and sheer resilience would clash in ways Hitler had never anticipated, and the consequences would echo across the world. By late October 1941, the German advance had slowed to a crawl. The first snows fell over the Eastern Front, dusting the endless forests and frozen rivers in white. For the Wehrmacht, accustomed to swift victories across Western Europe, winter was an enemy unlike any they had faced. Frostbite afflicted soldiers in staggering numbers. Weapons jammed in the bitter cold, and tanks sank into frozen mud, immobilized by a combination of poor planning and inhospitable terrain. The Blitzkrieg, which had promised speed and surprise, was now a grueling slog, with each kilometer fought tooth and nail. The Soviet Union, meanwhile, revealed a level of resilience that confounded German expectations. Factories were dismantled and relocated to the Urals, far from the reach of German bombers, allowing industrial production to continue unabated. Artillery shells, tanks, and rifles began pouring back to the front lines. Siberian divisions, trained in the harshest winters, were moved westward, their soldiers well-equipped and accustomed to temperatures that left the Germans shivering. The Red Army, once retreating in apparent chaos, now stood renewed, ready to strike at the heart of the overextended Wehrmacht. What the Germans had expected to be a quick victory had transformed into an ordeal that tested their endurance, logistics, and leadership. Supply lines stretched hundreds of kilometers, often across destroyed roads and frozen rivers. Food, fuel, and ammunition were constantly in short supply. Commanders debated how to keep the offensive alive as men suffered frostbite and equipment failed in the relentless cold. For Hitler, however, ideology still trumped practicality. He believed Moscow's fall was inevitable, confident that sheer willpower and terror would overcome every obstacle. But the Red Army had other plans, and the winter itself became an ally to the defenders. Please, if you are enjoying this in-depth historical exploration, click the subscribe button and like the video. It helps more people see this incredible story and understand the true cost of ideology, resilience, and strategy in war. By November, the Germans were approaching the outskirts of Moscow, yet every advance costs more than anticipated. Counterattacks by fresh Soviet divisions forced German units into defensive positions. Artillery fire raked through frozen forests, snipers and partisan forces harassed supply lines, and winter conditions caused vehicles to break down faster than they could be repaired. Morale began to falter, and the once confident Wehrmacht started to recognize that the campaign had taken on a new, unexpected dimension of battle, not just against men, but against nature, and an adversary that refused to yield. The Soviets capitalized on this shift masterfully. Moscow's defenders fortified positions, laid mines along key routes, and staged ambushes in dense forests and urban areas. Local militias and civilians contributed to the defense, reinforcing the city and setting up barricades in anticipation of the German approach. Meanwhile, Stalin, who had initially been paralyzed by the speed of the German advance, had mobilized reserves from Siberia and Central Asia. These troops, experienced in winter warfare, arrived with the discipline, equipment, and determination needed to turn the tide. The Germans, now facing stiff resistance, found their strategies of encirclement and rapid maneuver largely ineffective. They were no longer the hunters, they had become the hunters. Soviet counterattacks, combined with harsh winter conditions, forced the Wehrmacht to fight in a defensive posture. Communication lines were disrupted, reinforcements were delayed, and the very ground beneath their feet seemed to conspire against them. The soldiers, many of whom had never experienced such bitter cold, were increasingly demoralized, realizing that the simple march to Moscow had become an impossible struggle. Every day brought new challenges, Frozen rivers blocked critical supply routes, railways were sabotaged, and mud from thawing snow turned roads into impassable quagmires. The German army's numerical and technological advantages were undermined by exhaustion and environmental hardship. Each decision carried enormous consequences. One misstep could mean the loss of entire divisions. Yet Hitler demanded offensive action regardless of these realities. His ideological obsession with victory blinded him to the growing peril facing his army. By December, the stage was set for one of the most dramatic turns in the war. German troops, exhausted, starving, and freezing, had reached the outer defenses of Moscow. The Red Army, reinforced by Siberian troops, artillery, and fresh supplies, was prepared. The moment of reckoning had arrived. For the Germans, the dream of swift victory had been replaced by a grim confrontation with reality. The Soviet Union was far stronger, more adaptable, and far more resilient than anyone in Berlin had imagined. And as the icy winds swept across the battlefields, the Germans realized that winter was no longer a mere season 8. It was a weapon, a relentless adversary that strengthened the Soviets' resolve while eroding the invaders' will. The fight for Moscow would not be a brief clash of armies. It would be a desperate struggle for survival, where every misstep could have catastrophic consequences. The outcome of this encounter would not only determine the fate of the Eastern Front, but also signal a turning point in Hitler's grand ambitions. The Wehrmacht was about to face its most formidable challenge, yet one that would test the limits of endurance, courage, and human ingenuity. On December 6, 1941, the tide of Operation Barbarossa shifted dramatically. The Soviets, having endured months of retreat, regrouped, and preparation, launched a massive counteroffensive against the German forces at the gates of Moscow. Siberian divisions, well-equipped and trained for the brutal Russian winter, struck with precision and ferocity. For the exhausted Wehrmacht, this came as a complete shock. Soldiers who had advanced hundreds of kilometers in the past months were suddenly under siege by troops who not only matched their skill, but thrived in conditions that the Germans could barely endure. The counteroffensive was meticulously planned. Soviet artillery pounded German positions, while infantry and tank units exploited gaps in the enemy's overstretched lines. Snowstorms concealed movements and created natural cover for flanking maneuvers. German commanders, already struggling with supply shortages and fatigue, were forced to respond reactively rather than strategically. For every meter of ground they had fought so hard to capture, the Red Army now reclaimed too. Hitler's vision of Moscow falling before the onset of winter had collapsed, replaced by the grim reality of a strategic retreat. Amid the chaos, the morale of the German army plummeted. Soldiers, already weakened by frostbite and starvation, faced relentless assaults from a rejuvenated enemy. Communication lines were severed, and reinforcements arrived too slowly to make a difference. Some units were encircled and annihilated, while others barely managed to withdraw, leaving behind equipment, vehicles, and even the bodies of comrades. The sheer scale of the Soviet push demonstrated that what had once seemed an invincible army was, in fact, vulnerable when faced with preparation, resilience, and the unforgiving winter. The counteroffensive also highlighted a stark contrast between the ideologically driven German command and the pragmatic Soviet leadership. Stalin's insistence on mobilizing every available resource from Siberian troops to relocated factories ensured that the Red Army could sustain pressure and exploit German weaknesses. Each day of fighting further depleted German reserves, while Soviet forces, reinvigorated by fresh supplies and strategic coordination, gained momentum. The dream of a rapid Nazi victory had ended. Now, the Eastern Front was transforming into a war of attrition, where endurance, logistics, and adaptation mattered more than ideology or bravado. As the weeks passed, German forces were pushed back along an increasingly broad front. Moscow, once on the brink of falling, remained firmly under Soviet control. The counteroffensive forced the Wehrmacht onto a defensive footing for the first time in the campaign. Exhausted troops dug in under bitter cold, struggling to maintain cohesion against an enemy whose supply lines were shorter, whose soldiers were acclimated to the harsh conditions, and whose determination had only grown stronger. The strategic balance of power on the Eastern Front had shifted irreversibly. Hitler's overconfidence had proved catastrophic. His assumption that the Soviet Union would collapse under the weight of a concentrated strike ignored the reality of geography, climate, and the human spirit. The failure to capture Moscow in the critical months before winter meant that Germany faced a prolonged, brutal conflict for which it was ill-prepared. Operation Barbarossa, initially intended to secure a swift and decisive victory, had evolved into a cautionary tale about the dangers of underestimating an opponent, overextending forces, and placing ideology above practicality. The Soviet counteroffensive was not only a military victory but a psychological one. It signaled to the world then, to the German army, that Hitler's forces were not invincible. Cities and towns previously threatened by German conquest remained in Soviet hands. Civilians, who had endured occupation and displacement, witnessed their army reclaim territory and push the invaders back. For the Red Army, it was a moment of vindication, proof that resilience, preparation, and strategic patience could overturn even the most audacious of offensives. By December's end, German forces had been forced into retreat, losing thousands of men, tanks, and artillery pieces. The Eastern Front had become a grinding, attritional theater of war, with neither side able to claim easy victories. Hitler's ideological gamble had failed, and the war in the East would drag on for years, shaping the ultimate trajectory of World War II. Barbarossa demonstrated that size, speed, and surprise alone could not guarantee victory when faced with an adversary capable of enduring, adapting, and striking back decisively. In retrospect, Operation Barbarossa marked a turning point in the Second World War. It revealed the limits of Blitzkrieg when confronted with vast distances, harsh climates, and a resilient enemy. Hitler's hubris had underestimated the Soviet Union's industrial capacity, strategic depth, and human determination. The campaign set the stage for subsequent battles Stalingrad, Kursk, and beyond that would gradually erode German power and shift momentum irrevocably to the Allies. The lesson was clear. Overconfidence, ideology, and underestimation of one's opponent can be as deadly as any enemy weapon.